There we go. Good. Thank you, Judith, for the reminder. So here we are on our homepage. We're going to go and find our lessons for the day. Lessons for this Sunday. I think I put them up here. Yes, there they are. No, that's the second Sunday in Lent. That's not what I want. Let's go here.
To the second.
Here we go. From John's fourth gospel. Jesus came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well, and it was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Now his disciples had gone to the city to buy some food. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Now, Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that's saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would give you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? And are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" And Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But those who drink of the water, that I drink, I will give them will never be thirsty. And the water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." And the woman said to him, "Well, sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." So Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying I have no husband, for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is even not your husband. And what you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where you people worship, you must worship, is in Jerusalem." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. For you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. And when he comes, he will proclaim all things to us." And Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you." And just then his disciples came, and they were astonished that he was speaking with a woman. But no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you speaking with her?" And then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. And she said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" And then they left the city and they were on their way to him. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, "Rabbi, eat something." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Surely no one has brought him anything to eat." And Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of the one who sent me and to complete his work. Do you not say 4 months more, then comes the harvest? But I tell you, look around and see how the fields are ripe for the harvesting. The reaper is already receiving wages and is gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and reaper may rejoice together. For here the saying holds true: one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for that which you did not labor. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. Now, many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I've ever done. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them. And so he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves. And we know that this is truly the Savior of the world." Here ends the lesson. So knowing what we discussed before we started reading, and now having heard the lesson, does anything else stand out for you?
If we go back to the woman, one of the things that stands out is that while a woman's word was not generally believed, the people were curious enough with what she said to go out and see for themselves. It's one thing. There's other stuff too, but.
Also, he went and stayed there for 2 days with the Samaritans. They must have made him feel welcome. And the disciples were kind of there. Where were they?
Well, we don't know. Presumably they stayed with them as well, but
Yeah.
we don't know. It doesn't actually say that, but we could presume that perhaps. Because
They
they weren't
were-
exactly independent-minded people. They, you know, like little puppy dogs, they kind of followed Jesus wherever he went.
And so they were trying to reap. I mean, they were trying to communicate with the Samaritans in keeping with the message that they got about sowing and reaping. Or
By staying, they were being examples to the people there as followers of Jesus.
Okay.
So they set an example. And I like the analogy with the sower, the reaper, the laborers. While I have one idea about that, I don't know how right it is. So I'm going to not say anything for a little while.
Well, we don't know. See, we don't know if we don't test. You know.
But these are people that have not believed as he believes. And so how much more significant that is than talking to the people who already believe in him. Here the entire town is coming out because they're looking for something and he's providing it.
Interesting about the dialogue between the woman and Jesus. At first, her focus, interestingly, is very narrow. He says, "Give me a cup of water." And she says, basically, "Get it yourself." You know, it's, and he says, "Well, but if you really understood anything," you know, he's being a little condescending, a typical man talking to a typical woman in that typical age. "If you really understood anything, and if you really understood who I was, you wouldn't respond that way. You would have simply said, well, give me this water that you have. You know, I can give you a cup of water, but you got so much more, give that to me." And she goes like, "Who do you think you are? You know, Jacob gave us this well. Do you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob? You don't even have a bucket. And Jacob dug this well, and it's been giving us water for generations." And Jesus then says, oh, woman, if you only understood, I can give you water, that will well up from within you. And her worldview is still narrow. Her worldview is, okay, well, give me this water then, and I won't have to trudge here in the middle of the day to get all this water. Again, the middle of the day thing is significant because again, that's that whole discussion about she's had 5 husbands. She's sort of an outcast, not only, as a Samaritan, but even among her own people. She doesn't go there when all the other women from the town go there. She goes there when she has to go alone. So she's not only an outcast from the point of view of being a Samaritan relative to Jewish culture, but she ends up going there in the middle of the day, not when all the other women go out and they can chit chat and gossip and do all the things that people do when they go, with their water jars on their shoulders and go out there. She's going out there midday because they probably think that she's basically a harlot. She's been through this 5 times, and the man she has claimed as a quote unquote husband is not even her husband. She's basically living with somebody, in sort of more recent Christian parlance, living in sin, even by Samaritan standards.
Well, she must have come back as a changed woman.
Well, yeah, we're getting there,
And
George. Yeah.
enough so that the town is astounded.
Well, because she's
and to listen to this terrible woman, my God, something has happened to her, and they want to find out.
Well, John puts it so politely. She says, everything I have ever done. They already know what she's done. This conversation was probably more than just a couple of sentences, type thing. And, so that when you talk about it, so the implications are that she is an outcast among her own. And it's this one that Jesus talks to. And it's this one that says, you can have water living water welling up from deep within you. That's the key here. You are an outcast even among your own, and you can find living water within yourself. It isn't any outward righteousness that gives you this living water. It comes from the Spirit within. And you're right, it's that change that brings that living water about. But it's the agency of Jesus. It's Jesus who gives us that water. And the issue here is that he needs to break through. He needs to break through her vision, her what am I looking? What's the word I'm looking for? Her worldview. Her worldview is still, I don't want to trudge this. Her worldview is very physical. It's very almost pedantic. It's this mundane is what I guess the word I'm looking for. It's the workaday world of just, trudging this water back and forth, show me an easier way of doing that. And Jesus says, there's more to it than this. You need to find that. You need to look within. And that's what happens, is that he breaks with her, he breaks through that. And he does that by that sort of, she calls him a prophet. We might call him a seer. That he can see into her, see into her heart, see into her mind. That there's nothing, she can't hide anything from him. as we say, God can see the deep recesses of our hearts. And so now she is totally vulnerable to Christ, totally vulnerable to Jesus. And so in that vulnerability, all of her defenses are taken away. Even just her attitude, it's like, who do you think you are? You think you're better than Jacob? You don't even have a bucket. All that sort of, tough, that tough exterior is all gone. And she just totally folds into what Jesus has in store for her. So she goes and tells them about Jesus. Tells what? Tells them good news. I have found what I think is the Messiah. And they go like, well, what do you think? Why do you think that? Well, he told me all these things that I have ever done. He has seen into my heart. He has seen the deep recesses, my most intimate secrets. And that's why they go out to see him. Soon.
So, all of a sudden, this woman who has been such a sort of low life in the community has transformed and become a leader.
Quite a change.
Yeah,
An apostle.
yeah, that's so. It seems especially satisfying because she started from such a low point, I guess is what I'm saying. Yeah.
She proclaims good news. Remember, when we started our, fit for mission, theme for going forward, what did we say? How did Jesus' mission begin in the Gospel of Luke? I come to proclaim good news. A year of favor from the Lord, the year of Jubilee. What is she doing? She goes to the Samaritan city, to the Samaritan village. And she says, I have found the Messiah, the one who can see into the deep recesses of my heart. And they go out to see him.
Mm-hmm.
Carmen, you're muted.
It's interesting in this case that Joseph is a Jewish leader, a man who is supposed to know the best of the traditions of the Jewish religion. And yet this woman, who is exactly the opposite, Samaritan, someone who obviously has a history that is not a positive one, who in some ways is supposed to be ignorant of all the good traditions, is the one who is able to penetrate and recognize Jesus, while the one who knew all about God couldn't. And that's a big contrast there.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the play with water, the living water and the well.
Yeah.
Because a well can be dry.
Yes.
Or can become dry.
Yes.
While living water is basically rivers, brooks, places where the water is running.
Yes.
And even when they may run low, they still are supposed to run. So you receive something from them regularly. And so
actually, and when we look at the language in Greek, the idea of living water is actually flowing water that is constantly being replenished. And so, so the juxtaposition of a well, and that's why Jesus is saying this, next to a well, you're exactly spot on with that, which is it's not stagnant. Stagnant's not a good word, because you think of stagnant, you think of water that is on the verge of becoming putrid. well water isn't that. I mean, that's why wells are important. I mean, they can become that, certainly. But it's still water as opposed to running water, which is why the long tradition in Christianity is not to baptize in still water, but in running water. You know, meet us by the river, you know, all of the gospel songs and so on, go, you know, down by the river and so on. You know, in northern climes, it's not such a great thing because you know, it's cold. The fjords of Norway are a little hard to baptize people in, but you know, it's that kind of the movement of the water, you know, goes back to, you know, if you think of on the sermon from last Sunday and so on, this notion of the movement, the constant movement of God, you know, that God is not stagnant. God is not still. The language of the wind from last Sunday's lesson, there's this dynamism behind God, so that we had the wind blows where it will, and you cannot, you know where it comes or where it's going. Now we have this notion of flowing water, of living water. So that whenever you hear the phrase living water, we kind of think of it in terms of, yeah, it's life-giving, but the idea behind the language, the Greek language itself, is flowing. Because we know that that's clean. Unless you're the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, but that's different.
Well, that's cleaner than it was.
Yes, it is now, yeah.
I don't think it'll catch fire again for a while.
But there's another analogy where this living water, using the word again, wells up in you, because wells are fed from a deep source.
Yes.
So there's a lot of different ideas that come into mind when you're thinking about a well, in the sense where, yes, they do dry up and are good for nothing, but they also bring you something. And I don't have the Bible in front of me, but it is that you will have this water that will well up in you.
Well, yeah, in fact, that's, you know, in terms of this notion of welling up, I mean, we have the phenomenon, the physical phenomenon of an artesian well, where, you know, once you tap the water table, it just, you know, comes up, a gusher, as it were, or, you know, geyser, you know, those kinds of things. Yes, but the idea is the motion, the force, the movement, the idea that it is alive. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. That's why the phrase is translated into English, living, because there is movement, there is animation. Even that word animate, when we talk about animation, like we have animation in terms of a cartoon, for example, is an animated picture. The idea is it's anima is to give it life, to animate it, is to put soul into it. So the whole idea is to take something that was still and make it move. That's what animation is about. Somebody is like, the way I talk all the time, I'm very animated when I talk.
And to what degree, that's exactly the theological point of the story, that the well that Joseph represented, the fact that this is a well, this is a tradition that is represented by the well of Jacob, and Joseph represents, and yet the living water is represented by the woman who is receiving a message that may clash with what she has learned before, and yet she's able and willing to receive,
yes,
and to think about it,
Yeah.
and to respond to it, which is the living, that is the flowing.
the key word you just used was respond, because she responded, and her response was to go and tell. And then the people responded. And their response was to come and see. And that's all we hear of it. We don't hear anything, after that. But that's the dynamism within John's gospel, is this constant movement. Even at the we go to, we'll come to Good Friday soon enough. And what happens at the cross on Good Friday in John's gospel? What happens? They ask for the body of Jesus. And, so that Pilate says, good, go ahead and do it. So the traditional way of making sure they were dead was to make sure that the legs were broken so that they couldn't breathe. And so what happens? They come to Jesus, they realize he was already dead. So what do? They pierce his side with a lance. And what happens? Immediately, John says, blood and water flowed out. Again, there's that image again. See, so even at the very end, there's this movement. There's this animation, this constant living water is moving, so that water becomes one of the classical symbols of Christian life. Hence, the importance for us of the waters of baptism. And why baptism is such a central symbol. Regrettably, in most high liturgical churches, we've sort of minimized it, a little drop here, a little drop there. When I baptize, I try to maximize it as much as I can without
drowning somebody.
Without drowning somebody, like I described last Sunday. But that's just, or going down the river, which I wish we could do sometimes. Anyway, Kathy.
I guess this might be off topic a little bit.
Sure.
But one of the things that strikes me, and I know there's no super concrete example in John's gospel yet, but that the Samaritan people are so much more willing to receive Jesus than the Jews and to believe him.
Mm-hmm.
You look in some of the other gospels where they talk about where he's where he gets kicked out of his own town for saying that in the presence of prophecy has been fulfilled. And here's this a woman of nobody, a town of nobodies that are open, you know what I mean, are open to listening to him.
Well, but isn't it the way that in the history of Christianity, that the gospel message is most readily accepted by those who have the least to lose? Those at the margins, the poor, the powerless,
Is it the least to lose or the most to gain?
Well, they usually go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's what I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
But I like to look, it is the poor, but they're the ones who I guess they don't really have anything to lose, but they have so much to gain by this message is a message of hope for them that they've never had before.
It's sort of the glass half. It's not the glass half empty, it's the glass half full.
Yeah. I find it often very interesting when I hear churches talk about a full gospel. And usually what they're talking about is a fundamentally evangelical approach to their preaching and catechizing, which is perfectly perfectly orthodox, but that's where they stop. It's not full gospel. It's part gospel, because they stop very often at the social implications of the gospel. Of, what are the communal implications of Jesus' teaching? Very often it comes to a point where suddenly when it becomes whose ox is getting gored, when you ask the deep question, you know, it's I've said it at St. Luke's a few times. Gosh, this sounds an awful lot like Marxism, doesn't it? You know, when you read the opening chapters of Acts, and it says they put everything into a common fund, and each took as what they need, each gave as they were able, and each took as they needed. Doesn't that sound like Marx? I mean, come on, let's be honest about this. You know, that was the social implication of what they were doing. And we have, over the centuries, always massaged the gospel into whatever was favorable to our most powerful social implications for those who could maintain power by using the gospel as part of their leverage. So, for example, when I was in seminary, what was then called liberation theology was considered heretical. It was considered heretical. Now that was 60 years ago. Now, when I was studying, it was 50 years ago. It's sort of kind of fallen off the edges now because it was pushed to the edges by that appellation, you know, calling it that, pushed it away because it was dangerous, it was conceived, to those who held power. Because it was finding a hearing among the poor. And because it had the capacity to leverage power for the poor. Because one of the things that we were taught in seminary, in terms of the social teaching of the gospel, was this phrase: the preferential option for the poor. That at all times, when given the choice, that we must always give the preferential option for the poor. And that was always to be the choice. And we were taught that. I mean, and that was considered orthodox social teaching. Of course, I was taught as a Roman Catholic, and, you know, we're just a bunch of liberals anyway. So, you know, it was just, but regrettably, I can say that when the Catholic Church itself, and this is my personal testimony, when the Catholic Church itself started to slide away from that was when I started to reject the Catholic Church. Because it started to go the other direction. It started to have a preferential option for power. And I said, no. It's interesting that the Episcopal Church used to be the church that traversed the corridors of power. And in the last 50 years has become increasingly the voice for the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed. The roles have almost totally reversed. I remember in graduate school when I was teaching summer school at Catholic University shortly before I left ministry in the Catholic Church. And I had the great honor of being a colleague with George Higgins, who was a Jesuit, who was one of my idols in one sense, became a mentor. He was one of the founders and builders of what was called the worker priest movement within the United States. Extremely strong, great thinker, deep and great thinker in the worker priest movement and social justice. Back in the day of when the Catholic Church was very strong in labor unions and so on, and the voice for workers' rights and things like that. And we had quite deep discussions over bourbon. Quite frankly, to be quite frank.
Loosens the tongue.
During preprandium, we gather at 4 o'clock for cocktails before dinner, and sometimes we'd go down a little late for dinner because it'd be 5:30 and they'd be calling us for dinner.
Oh. I think
He
we
said
lost
something he shouldn't have.
him.
It froze again.
That's because he's talking about alcohol.
Yeah.
Well, I was in Puerto Rico. I did my master's degree in theology in Puerto Rico. So liberation theology was the daily food at seminary. And because we were in the middle of it, and we were reading the sources, Gustavo Gutierrez from Peru and others that were part of that, and a lot of base communities were from Brazil. So we were reading many of these writers. It was a rich time, and it began with the Catholic Church after the Second Vatican. Like they said, was that after the Second Vatican, there was the need to examine reality, to simply look at the reality of life and political structures. And that's when they realize how the church has supported groups and social classes and political principles that were not the best for the development of the country. And that's where it all began.
Yeah.
But
Thank
it
you.
was a strong criticism. I
Well,
remember.
Oscar Romero, that era, he was a child of privilege who eventually had a major conversion. I think the gremlins are out to get me.
Well, my New Testament teacher was a Dominican ex-priest who also ended being a professor at the seminary, evangelical seminary, where I studied my master's. And so we were very exposed to all that and had great discussions. So the principles that I have learned about exegesis and application of the Bible were based on liberation theology. So,
Yeah, great. Well,
troublemaker through and through.
well, but then we look at today's lesson, and we can, say, well, he was a woman, as a Samaritan. We can sort of dismiss all of that as being sort of, not irrelevant, but oh yeah, okay, Jesus, talked to women, but there are deep, deep implications for all of this. When we start talking about marginalized, who are the marginalized in our society today? And we look at current events. Look at what's happening. With all due respect, and not to get tied up in partisan politics, but the social trends, and it is the church's responsibility to address social trends. I have to be careful what I do from the pulpit. It's a different place. That's a different place. But when we have conversations, the social trends, like in a place like Florida, let's be blunt, where there's increasing anti-LGBTQ strains of thought, the marginalization of women in power, the marginalization of women's rights in terms of their own capacity to choose choices for their health care. Whatever you believe about, let's raise it up beyond the narrow question of abortion to the larger question of health care, because it's expanding beyond that one narrow question into the larger question of reproductive rights and self-care and all of those things.
Racial.
you get beyond that to, the question of personal freedom relative to voting, education.
Hmm.
There's a lot going on in our society that is very dangerous and has a lot of implications relative to that fifth promise of our baptismal covenant, the dignity of every human being. And I find it increasingly difficult to remain silent, or at least tacit. Let's put it that way. I don't mean silent from the point of view of I don't care, but rather, I don't want to rock the boat kind of thing. That if it requires me to leave the pulpit to say that, I need to say it. But I think one of the things that I had discussion with a colleague about this recently. One of the problems in the church is this, that I believe very strongly, this comes from my Roman Catholic background, quite frankly, that one of the roles of the laity are to be the voice of the gospel in the world. And that, in fact, that's not the role of the clergy. The role of the clergy is to form the hearts and minds, the consciences of the laity. And it is the role of the laity to be the voice of the gospel in the world. But what happens is we have co-opted the laity too often. We have not formed them well in the values of the gospel and of the kingdom. And so, what we get is this. Oh, that's religion. Keep it over there and keep religion out of politics. I don't have a buzzer, so nobody's going to be able to buzz me quiet here. That's bullshit. Look at today's gospel lesson. Jesus never did that. Jesus' implication throughout his preaching is that the values of the kingdom of God have something to say about the way we live our lives in the world every day, the way we relate to one another every day. That means polis, P-O-L-I-S, the Greek word, from which we get politics. How do we live together? How do we relate to one another? What policy? Another word that derives from that word. All of that has to do with our inner value system. So don't tell me that religion has nothing to do with politics. It has everything to do with politics. The separation of church and state has to do with the state not telling me what religious values I have to believe, and the church not telling the society what religious values the society at large has to believe. But everyone in the society needs to know what their religious values are, and then have the debate as to what the implications of those things are for our human lives together. That's where we fail.
What we are seeing in Florida is the great hypocrisy that the so-called Christians in that political event that is going on down there espouse. I don't know how they can call themselves Christians when you try to take away every freedom that half of our society used to enjoy, that who is speaking up against this and pointing this out, that this reminds me of Germany in 1933, where you took away the books from the people so that they couldn't read what would help them understand what was happening in their life. It's happening over again. And hence the term history repeats itself. And I guess we're in one of those phases.
I heard a thinker the other day say, and it is sad to say it is true. What I've seen, the data seems to be coming true, is that we go through these phases, you use the word phase, every 80 years. And when you look at it, that's exactly where we are.
And it's unfortunate. I read somewhere or heard somewhere someone say, when fascism, which has been rearing its ugly head for years already, when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a Bible.
Mhm.
And that's what we're seeing. And yet, when you read the Gospels, social justice, the word justice comes up an awful lot. And we kind of push it to the side and don't look at what social justice really means, aside from whatever the political body says justice is.
Well, when the last time that the Gremlins took me offline for a bit, I came back and I heard Carmen talk about the Second Vatican Council. One of the things I am put in mind of when I was in seminary, again, I think one of the saintly teachers that I studied was Paul VI, Pope Paul VI. And he said this, he said, you cannot have peace unless you first strive for justice. Justice is the first condition of peace. So that true peace, if you conceive of peace as a lack or the absence of confrontation, yes, but that's not peace.
Right.
That's just simply quiet.
Truce.
Mhm.
Yeah, truce. That's a good way of putting it. True peace only comes in a just society. And I've said this before, and I've gotten in trouble every time I preach this homily. It's a sermon I preach continual, and I have to preach on Sunday because we failed to get a preacher for Evensong. So I might give this sermon. I did give it once in a different form at St. Luke's, but maybe I'll give it on Sunday. And that is, you cannot love unless you first make justice your spiritual practice.
Mm.
Because, and I come at this from someone, I mean, my academic discipline is canon law, is law. So my study was the theories of law. And so the idea is, and law is the pursuit of justice. And I remember a professor of mine years and years and years ago saying to me, well, to us, not just to me, but that gentleman, at the time we're all men, he said, as canon lawyers, you are the church's ministers of justice. That your role in the church is to create an environment of justice within the community of the church. That, and so we talked about that quite a bit, but the point, this point being that justice is a matter of giving to people what they are owed by their nature. What they are owed by nature. So, for example, And the matter of law is a matter of words. Again, we study scripture in these Bible studies. We talk about the words a lot. So words have a lot to do. Notice what we talk about when we talk about we do nice things for people. We feed the poor or feed the hungry, clothe the naked. We call that in general in our society, what do we call that? Charitable works. What does the word charity mean? It comes from the Latin word caritas. What does the word caritas mean in Latin? It's translated into English, love. Well, these are works of love. It's a work of love to give food to the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, to clothe the naked. Is it really? I ask this question. Or is it an act of justice? Because is it not someone's right, if they are hungry, to have something basic to eat? Is it not their right to have basic clothing? Is it not their right to have a safe place to call home? Is it not their right to have sufficient drink? Is it not their right to have a basic minimal medical care? Is it not, and you can go down the list. Again, it sounds like Marxism. But is it not a human, because of their nature as a human being, that if they are deprived of these things through no fault of their own, is it not their right to demand these things from society? And simply giving it to them then is a matter of working justice, not an act of love. Going over and above the minimum level, that may be considered an act of love. K, I know you're champing at the bit here.
You can imagine that I'm kind of sitting here going, hey. I just completed a major paper on liberation theology.
I know.
So for the rest of the group, so but I agree with you, say what it's justice and the act of love is moving on, but I think justice is, you still have to do more than just meeting the basic needs. You have to create that situation where people can meet their own basic needs. And I think that's still part of justice.
Yes.
It is moving into the realm of love, but
that's what I'm saying, is basically creating a world order, creating an environment, creating a society, whatever it is, where that's not the issue. That if we're going to create a just society, that's what you're talking about. But for me to say it's an act of charity to give somebody who is hungry through no fault of their own something to eat, that's not an act of charity, it's an act of justice.
It's a human right.
Yes, I am supporting their right to eat, to give them a place to live, to shelter overnight when they're cold and out in the middle of nowhere, and when they have, through no fault of their own, they have no place to live. That is an act of justice, not an act of charity. So I'm making a distinction there, because then you can start talking about creating a social order that provides these things for a whole class of people within our society. Soon, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say, I mean, that an act of charity, it sounds condescending, which is missing the point.
Yeah,
And
well, go to Dickens. We can just go back to Dickens. The opening chapter or the opening, couplets of Christmas Carol. Are there not poorhouses? Are
And you need both, because sometimes what you can provide is just a place to sleep or some food. I mean, I
Right.
remember in Nashville, there was this guy who was an executive in one company, lost his job and was doing whatever to survive. At the point we met him, he was living in his car because he could not even afford a place to live. And he had a house and in a place that we could not afford in town, and came down. The wife divorced him. The family was in pieces. The only relationship he had was with a daughter who wanted to be with him as much as possible. And what we invented was inviting him to the little house, the little works in the house. And we tried to make him come at 10, 10:30, 11, so that we could stop him in the work he was doing and say, we're making some food for lunch. Can you join us? And the guy was so grateful because we didn't know how much he had to buy food. So really, sometimes that was what he needed. And we
that's always-
suspected that was what needed. But at the same time, there are situations, and I was about to say about Florida, where when you look around in the United States, you have more ethnic diversity than ever in every town. Look around Lebanon, look around Anvil, look around all the towns. And yet, sometimes we're not talking about that diversity, or what would living together mean? And that requires another conversation. Do we let separate ministries like we have done, or do we need to talk about how we live in peace with each other? And that's what disturbed me a lot in Florida, denying the history of the African Americans and not giving the opportunity for a class to simply read a book by a Black writer just to learn and talk about it. That's a denial of justice and a denial of the dignity of another human being.
Mhm.
And that
And that's what
is disturbing.
I was going to comment on with what Soon said about charity seems to be like you're looking down on somebody. But what you were saying, Carmen, is that the justice upholds human dignity. And so often, if somebody is needy and they have to take charity, it is not encouraging to them, because it is, I am the lowest of the low and I have no dignity.
Mhm.
And that makes it doubly hard to serve the purpose, because we don't all know how to supply the other things that are needed to uphold the dignity of the individual, as well as feeding them and giving them a roof over their head from time to time.
See, part of what I'm trying to get at with all of this is that, and part of this is a bit philosophical and maybe a bit too abstract, but very often what we forget is that words inform our understanding of things. And we can use words in such a way that we then begin to misunderstand the reality of a situation because of the words that we have adopted and adapted to describe the situation. So when we use the word charity, for example, we then think of ourselves as being loving by doing these things. So when Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you, of course I love, or love your neighbor as yourself. Of course I love my neighbor. I give to this food pantry and I do this and I do that. Well, are you really loving your neighbor, or are you, or, or are you acting, or act, the Micah 6:8 mandate? Act justly. Are you acting justly? Well, what does that mean? Well, nobody even knows what that means because they don't even think about acting justly. What goes under that rubric? So that when we begin to think of these things, we need to think more clearly. And God forbid we should actually discuss them to, get some clarity about what these things really are in our society. So that when you begin to have these public debates about public policy, can we actually talk about, what is justice? What is, when we talk about justice too often, all we think about is criminal justice. And rather, what social justice, as you mentioned before, is almost not on the plate at all. That's a liberal thing. Now the new term is, that's a woke concept. You're woke. It's wokeism. And boy, all you need to do is label somebody with that, and you are off the rails. That's the new epithet that can be thrown at you. And so it's CPAC and all these different things. You label somebody as woke and you are done for. They won't even hear what you have to say. Whether it has to do with racial reconciliation, LGBTQ rights, the new legislation that's going around relative to trans affirming treatments for gender dysphoria and all these kinds of things. People are, these are dangerous things. These are actually dangerous things for individuals. And yet people are just tossing this stuff around like it's, whether or not you like vanilla or chocolate ice cream. It's crazy talk. And yet people are not taking any of this seriously, because it may not have a direct impact on them until it does, and then it's too late. And that goes back to the point, George's earlier point about the 1930s. Because by the time people realize it has an import on their personal lives, it's too late. It's too late. There is a very interesting book that I read a while back at the behest of one of my former parishioners when I was back at St. Mark's, about World War I, interestingly. It's called This Great and Holy War. It's about how World War I was actually a war that was seen as a war of religion, and how God became, and I remember a history prof back in college, actually bringing this up, that the German forces, when they went into World War I, emblazoned on their belt buckles, their belt buckles, this was actually minted into their belt buckles as Gott mit uns. God is with us. But this was not only we can blame the Germans because they lost. So we went, we get the right to history. So we really push that. But the Americans did the same thing. The Brits did the same thing. We all did the same thing. God is on our side. God is never on the side of any warring faction, ever. God is on the side of justice. So if you can claim you are in a just cause, then it is the cause of justice for which you fight, perhaps, and only justly fought. So if, for example, when it rends my heart when I hear about the war in Ukraine, when I hear about Ukrainian soldiers committing war crimes, or Americans, like back in the day, the whole My Lai massacre, that whole thing, if all of us here are old enough to remember that sort of stuff, that rends my heart as much as anything else. Just wars, that's a tenuous idea, but it's possible, I suppose. Yet these things we live in a complicated world, and we don't have enough time to sort it all out today. but we need to start thinking, as rational beings. God gave us brains. And one of the wonderful things, we did a stewardship thing several years ago at St. Luke's. It was called 101 Reasons to be an Episcopalian. And I took a survey of people. I asked them to write down a reason why they were Episcopalians. And I got several of these back. We need not check our brains at the door. And that's one of the things that I just hope that that's still true. And that we can be that voice in our community still. So we're drawing close to our time. Any final thoughts on the Samaritan woman?
No, but we never got around to the second part of the reading.
Well, actually, we did in terms of, that they all went out to see her or see him.
I'm past that.
Okay.
My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and he talks about the sower, the laborers.
Oh, but we did talk about that a bit. We talked about that and that is filtered throughout the rest of the gospel.
Right. But-
And that's part of what we're talking about, is going out, that proclamation when she went and told the community.
Right.
That's the apostleship that, Jesus plants the seed. Just what we're talking about here, the notion of this idea of justice. What we're doing here is that this is the living it out. This is the living it out. Jesus came to save. He gave us the work to do it. I talked about it a little bit last week at the sermon. We're the collaborators. We're the co-creators. We're the, co-workers with Jesus in the vineyard. We didn't plant the seeds. God does that.
Well, in the final sentence, others have labored, and you have entered into their labor.
Yes. And here we are, doing the hard work of figuring it out. Kathy.
There's a woman by the name of Dorothy Soleil. She's passed away, but she has an excellent book. It's called An Introduction to Theology, that talks about liberation. It talks about conservative, liberal, and liberation, but primarily liberation. It's a excellent book, and it's a relatively easy read. It's
What's the name again? What's her name?
Dorothy Soleil. See if I can find it real quick here. Yeah. Oh no, it isn't An Introduction to Theology. Well, it's called Thinking About God.
Okay.
And
Right.
she's a German woman, but this is she taught in the United States for a long time. So her English is really good, and this one is not translated.
The writer.
Is Dorothy, Dorothee Soelle.
Ah, soil. One of my favorites.
Dorothy Soleil. It's
Yes.
because it's German. It's
It should be an umlaut.
O.
It should be an umlaut O instead of the
Yeah.
OE.
Schöne,
Yeah.
But
I have
schöne.
several of
she's-
her books.
Yeah,
that
I
she
have
has written
another
for
one of her
her-
books I want to read.
Yeah.
And that was my primary reference from one of my two primary references for my paper.
Good,
She's a
thank
good
you.
one on that.
Thank you.
But the other thing I wanted to also let you know is that there's a site called BibleOdyssey.org
Okay,
that has little tidbits and stuff. And I just pulled up I just searched on the 12 tribes of Israel,
uh-huh,
and I pulled up a map that it has a lot of other really interesting stuff on it. If you want to, Deidre uses it a lot.
okay.
That's how I know about it.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm still old school. I use paper things, so.
I know. Well, yeah, I'm kind of, I'm kind of switched between the two, but it has an interesting map of the 12 tribes, and the area
can't
around
spell.
Galilee looks like it should have been either Ishkar or Naphtali, and Manasseh would have been most of Samaria. But whether that's really the same or not is, whether it's really the tribes or not is, who knows?
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, they were divided up so many different times.
Yeah.
Subgroups and that sort of, I can't spell, so the second one should be the way it is. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody. We will be seeing you around. We'll see
I'll
you
see
in
you in a
church.
month.
Yes, Kathy's off to
St. Martin.
warmer climes for a couple of weeks and then back, and then she's going to be up in Connecticut
Yes.
doing work, keeping us safe as an engineer. So not a train engineer, although we need some people to keep us safe that way these days, but as a nuclear engineer. So she's gonna be doing an audit at a nuclear plant up there. So
Well, a nuclear supplier, but
yeah. Oh, okay. That's what it is. All right. Thank you. All right. So good study, everybody. Great discussion. Thank you so much. See where we can go with this Bible stuff all of a sudden. Great
I
work.
think Judas has something to say.
Oh, Judith.
I'd like to share a word with George once you finish recording.
Okay, I can turn that off. All right.